Yeah. Good morning to everybody and welcome to the site. Today we are hosting Chad for a presentation titled Finding Frogs in Africa. Chad is an honorary research fellow here at SAIAB, and I'll hand over to him to just introduce himself and share his presentation with us. Enjoy.
Cool. Thanks, Lucky. Cool. Let's start by thank you so much for having me, guys. This is my home away from home. I love this place, one of the best genetics platforms in the country, and it's very quiet. So it's nice to come in here and run some samples. So thanks so much for having me. But today my talk is entitled Finding Frogs in Africa. It's got science in it, but it's got a lot of photos, and I'm sure a lot of guys want to see cool frogs. So let's get started. First and foremost, I am a herpetologist through and through. I'm completely and utterly passionate about reptiles and amphibians, and as of late, I'm becoming more and more interested in frogs. I find them absolutely fascinating. And from a research perspective, I am, generally speaking, a systematist that works with phylogenetics. I've recently started dabbling in different fields of herpetology, but through and through, I am someone who likes the animals and works on any method to study them. So most of my stuff is based on systematics, but I do have other papers in the pipeline at the moment. In terms of my outputs, I'm also very, very passionate about popular science. I think it's a critical component of doing science in Africa is disseminating your knowledge, especially when you're working on charismatic groups that have the potential to be a danger to the general public. So snake stuff, frog stuff, anything that people generally have a fear towards, I believe it's very important that we get our research out there. And I do this through community-based outreach. I've done a lot in this region, a lot of stuff down here, but recently, since moving to Cape Town, I've been doing a lot of frog talks and frog walks. It actually makes it very interesting because in this part of the world, you'll end up doing stuff in summer, but as you move into the Western Cape, because of the winter rainfall, it's better to do it in winter. So also, because of my time in the field, I've gotten very passionate about photography, and I've disseminated my photos through many channels, and it's actually helped my research a lot just to be able to get my stuff out there. But in terms of frogs, why frogs? And the reason it's frogs, I can't explain it to you. I absolutely and unequivocally love these animals, super passionate about them. I think they're fascinating, both morphologically, incredibly plastic, so they can almost exploit any habitat in sub-Saharan Africa, and genetically and evolutionary, they are amazing animals. In terms of the main question I get taught every single talk, are these animals dangerous? In sub-Saharan Africa, you don't need to worry. We're not in South America. We've got no poison dart frogs. So these animals are not dangerous, but you wouldn't want to lick this frog. That's what I want to say. So this is the bad rubber frog. This is the one that you shouldn't lick. Most people don't lick frogs, but if you're my ex-PhD supervisor, I dared him to do it on a field trip, and he didn't work well for a few days after. But to begin with, he wasn't that great to start with. So these frogs are amazing, very beautiful animals, and other animals will avoid them, but they are not dangerous to humans. And generally speaking, toads are also the same. So they emit bufotoxins. So if you see a toad in your water bowl for your dog, just take the toad out, throw the water out, put new water in. But generally speaking, frogs are not a danger to humans at all in Africa. Where can you find them? You can find them virtually anywhere. Although they are intrinsically linked with water, as most people expect, these animals are highly adapted to a wide range of habitats. So I've seen them almost everywhere. They do well in the desert, they do well in the forest, they do well in the grasslands, and they are particularly abundant in wetlands. These two guys were found on the west coast of South Africa. They're rain frogs, highly specialized frogs that we get in South Africa. And why do they matter? So frogs are incredibly important bioindicators. Anyone that's worked in the field, anyone here, I'm pretty sure has noticed when they move through systems, they start to hear abundance of frog calls in areas that are generally pristine. And as you move into areas that are not pristine, you start to hear it being dominated by things like rain frogs and toads. So wherever you hear less frogs, generally speaking, in built-up areas, you can assume the water isn't the greatest quality. It obviously doesn't hold always, but these animals can be very important bioindicators that their presence just shows you how important the water is. Additionally, for food web structure, they are important components of both the aquatic and the terrestrial environment because they both prey and predator, both in the tadpole stage and when they become adults. So they are a critical component of most food webs. And in terms of mosquitoes, everyone that works in mosquitoes know they're not great in Africa. They're one of the biggest vectors for malaria. And with frogs, especially around wetlands, that's one of their main food sources. So frogs are a very critical component of our ecosystems, and we need to protect them, especially when they are incredibly threatened. So the recent IUCN Red List, they released their last report very recently, 2023, and they listed frogs as the most threatened vertebrates on the planet. They are very threatened. 41% of the world's amphibians are threatened. So that's including your caecilians, your salamanders and newts, and your frogs. And there's about 37 confirmed extinctions just since 2004. So frogs, they are kind of in peril at the moment, and 909 species are currently data deficient. So over 8,000 species currently recorded in amphibians, and about over 900 of them are still data deficient. So there's a lot we still need to learn about these animals. And in terms of the amphibians in the Afrotropics, the regions that I generally work on, we have about 1,170 amphibians. We don't get salamanders or newts below the Sahara. So we get caecilian, of which there's about 37, and the rest are Anurans. And within that, 15% of the global total. So just within the Afrotropics, we have 15% of the world's amphibians, 99% endemism. So those frogs, of those 1,170, 99% of them only exist in the Afrotropics. So very special animals, and 37% of those Anurans are threatened, 13% are data deficient. So once again, there's quite a paucity of research there. And based on their synthesis, they believe habitat loss is the greatest driver of why we don't have, or basically the biggest threat to frogs right now. And interestingly, 13% of South Africa's frogs are threatened. So if you put that into a scale, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're number 8 for Africa for listing on how many threatened taxons we are. I think number 1 is currently Seychelles, weirdly enough, because they're an island, they have much less. Second, Madagascar. Third is Sao Tome, and then you start getting places like Kenya, Tanzania, and Congo. Congo, unfortunately, is very understudied. So I rate in the next few years, once we start doing more research, we're going to start finding new species that they are themselves also threatened. So in terms of Grahamstown, I decided to put a list together of some of the cooler frogs you guys can find if you go looking. In my 10 years here, these were my 4 favorite frogs, mainly because they were the hardest ones to find. They actually may not be the most interesting for the guys on this video watching from KZN or from Western Cape, but these are kind of the interesting ones for me. This one is probably one of the only frogs that can be considered a regional endemic. It's called the bushveld rain frog. Well, not the bush, but it's actually the thicket rain frog now. This one's a subspecies, and that one is generally restricted to the Albany thicket. On the top, you got the rattling frog, which is actually quite common. You got the eastern leopard toad, and all of the frog people are going to shout at me, but actually western leopard toad, eastern leopard toad, there's not much in it. So let's not get the Cape frog guys to kill me, but there's not a lot in it. And then you got the yellow striped reed frog over there. Next, in terms of the general area, I would say the most special place is Hogsback. Hogsback is amazing for frogs. You've got 3 near endemics. You've got this Amatola toad with this mythical frog. Everyone's trying to find it. Vendicophymus amatolicus. It's restricted to the Amatola Mountains. On top of that, you've got Thorin's caco, which was named by Van Conradi after Thorin because of the lore between Lord of the Rings. He's the king under the mountain, that little frog, very, very small. And under that, you've got the Anhydrophrini, which we colloquially call Anhydroweenies. They're very hard to find. And then below that, you've got the plaintive rain frog. It's not an endemic for that region, but they're just super cool and super fat, so we all love them. Next, you've got, basically I have to do this. I don't talk about every taxonomic group, but these guys are amazing. Everyone knows that you work on frogs in Africa, you have to find this group, the rain frogs, or the breviceps. Amazing animals because their reproduction is not linked with water, and they can actually reproduce in quite arid environments. They're very common in forests, and if you go to the west coast, you can also find them in the dunes. But these are very much a sub-Saharan endemic. You don't get them above the Sahara, and most of that diversity is sitting in South Africa, especially around Western Cape. But there's actually at this point in time 1 or 2 species there. But amazing animals, and they're generally called the avocado frogs amongst the world. Next, you've got Western Cape, which is probably one of our biggest bastions of biodiversity for frogs. The mountain ranges in Western Cape are basically isolating these species, creating these amazing animals such as ghost frogs, You've got the western leopard toad there, which is restricted to the Cape Peninsula. You've got the Arthrodactyla, which are the moss frogs. These are some of the smallest and hardest frogs to find. I spent the last 2 years looking for all of them. It's like a game of Pokemon Go that I keep on losing. And then on the bottom there, you've got the strawberry rain frog, which is the most grumpy because everyone thinks he's a strawberry. There's the... There we go, the ghost frogs again. I couldn't resist. There are several ghost frogs in our country, and everyone who's gone to Table Mountain has heard someone shove the name Table Mountain ghost frog down their throat. They are amazing animals. They are very beautiful, and they're restricted to the Western Cape. There's currently a species actually in Eastern Cape, which is the Keates, which is a subspecies, but we're not sure how much longer that subspecies will persist. So they, generally speaking, are quite dominant within the Western Cape. But they are amazing frog because they're one of South Africa's true amazing frogs that people will come from around the world to see. They love living on rocks. They are very adept to living in like super cold environments. So they are specialist to the Western Cape floristic region. Next, we have KwaZulu-Natal. We can't do a frog talk without KZN. The reason for that is that KZN harbors huge amounts of arboreal frog diversity. So even though the frogs are quite well extended into Mozambique, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga, some of the frogs out here are some of the most charismatic and beautiful frogs you can find. Some of them include the Pickersgill reed frog, critically endangered. You've got the kloof frog at the top. Then you've got some of the leaf folders below that. And then I had to mention some of the coolest frogs in Africa, which are the tree frogs and their allies, the squeakers. These are some of the more charismatic animals that you find in South Africa. And in Africa, because of their massive eyes, they look very much like red-eyed tree frogs. And these are the frogs that often make it onto the front guides of most books. There isn't the highest diversity of them, but they are very dominant in the African literature. And they are beautiful animals. We don't get them in this part of the world, but as you start moving up into the more tropical regions, these animals become a lot more dominant. So I wanted to mention a bit of research from South Africa. Most of my work as of late has been based in Upper Africa, but this project I did with the Wetland Ecology Lab with Ryan Wasserman and with ASRG, which attended Lulu, and we're basically looking at the wetlands of the Makweleka wetlands in the northern part of Kruger. You would assume that Kruger National Park is one of the most sample places you can find. But when you look a bit closer, we actually managed to find that little yellow guy, which was for the longest period of time not considered to be the species we actually found it to be. So what we found there to be, which was once called the golden leaf-folding frog, once we ran genetics on it, we actually figured out it was the snoring leaf-folding frog, which was extending into the northern tip of Kruger from Zimbabwe. And for the longest time, if you look at all the field guides, we thought it was the golden leaf-folding frog extending upwards from Mpumalanga. So this was a really cool study, and it showed that even though places are well studied, you can still find quite a lot. So you guys may have come across this poster. It's a nice poster we put together for the community of Makweleka and for Northern Kruger, which details all their frogs. It was such a fascinating part. Yes, the poster's upstairs. And then we've also got some popular science articles in the Kruger magazine. So this work went very far, mainly because these animals are so beautiful and everyone loves to see them. I also wanted to delve quickly into Africa. It's an amazing, obviously one of the most amazing parts of the world, especially in these places such as Botswana. Sorry, I had to put one gecko photo and I couldn't resist. This is the Walrus gecko. I got him recently in Botswana, actually about 2 years ago, actually now. But they're absolutely beautiful. And on the left of that is one of the most charismatic frogs we get. The biggest one, the African or the giant bullfrog. Some people call it the African, but this is the giant one. This is the one that gets to the size of a dinner plate. And it is known to have eaten birds and bats. It's eaten several small children. No, I'm just joking. But they're amazing animals. When you pick them up, they are enormous and they are quite common in certain parts of South Africa, but we are definitely seeing a retraction in their range. Unfortunately, they have an amazing food source. They are big and they've got quite a bit of meat on them. So this is definitely one of the frogs we need to watch out for and protect because they're not hard to find when you do find them. They're highly aggressive and they will protect their pond. So they're not shy away from humans, which makes them much easier to catch. Next, we have Zambia. I did some work in Zambia about 2 years ago, collecting specimens. Northern Zambia is still a treasure trove of biodiversity. In my opinion, it's a place that we should all start looking in. It's one of the easier places to access. I did a talk the other day at Rhodes about places I suggest people can go work. Zambia is one of the most beautiful and most accessible places in Africa. Their road networks are amazing. The people are kind, they're generous, and they're very keen on research. You can get your permits together and your ethics together. This is a place I would consider sampling, even from an ecological, conservation, and a behavioral point of view. The research we've done so far, we're starting to look closer at some of the more charismatic taxa. On the top left there, which you're right, is the Lemaire's toad. Interesting enough, that is in breeding color. It's normally quite a dull green frog, but when it gets into breeding season within their ponds, they actually go this vibrant yellow. Vanna Conradi, my PhD supervisor, did a paper on them. It's quite a nice one to go find. Other than that, one of the more interesting frogs right now is probably the less interesting frog. As with everything in this world, we're not going to find a new lion species, but you will find a new shrew. So these animals, because they are perceived to be quite dull, boring, and brown, they're probably one of the more interesting animals from a phylogenetic and evolutionary perspective. The more we look at these puddle frogs, which are called Phinobatrachus, because of their ability to basically take hold of any puddle system and just dominate, they're one of the animals that I think is going to have a massive reshuffle in their phylogenetics over the next few years. The bottom there, that's called the common reed frog. Based on taxonomy, that's considered the same species as the painted reed frog in Grahamstown now, which people are still trying to wrap their heads around, but frogs are quite a complicated group to work on. The reason for that is they're very morphologically plastic, and we have to still get access to nice libraries of genetics in which to compare them to. So at the moment, although things seem stable, they're in a perpetual state of flux. So the more we look at them, the more we find. So I would invite people to look at these groups in more detail. One of the areas that I've worked very extensively within in my career as a herpetologist is Angola. I got my chance with the Okavango Wilderness Project a few years ago, and since then I've been back once. And this area is such a big focus for everyone. I'm sure everyone knows about this project. Paul Skelton was a big part of it as well, because of the paucity of research within the region prior to these studies. It was a product of war, and the area was kind of just deemed a no-go zone. And because of that, when everyone started going in, they started finding things that we didn't expect to find. Obviously, it comes with a bit of danger. When the National Geographic videographer comes to you and says, let's take a selfie with an RPG, you say, you have to do that. Why would you not? But this place is probably one of my favorite places on the planet because of just how amazing the biodiversity is and how interesting the ecosystem is. It's so similar in terms of its biomes, its biodiversity, and its ecosystems to South Africa. It's almost a perfect analog in many ways. And because of that, we're likely to find much higher diversity in these pockets if we just look a bit more. So when you talk about frogs, you have to talk about crocs because they are often in the same water bodies as you. So this is something we often come across. So when we're working especially in Upper Africa and in Kruger National Park, Limpopo, these are not our friends. We have to be very cautious of them because they love froggers. Because froggers are always looking up, they're not looking down. So these are animals that we are very passionate about, but we have to always be wary of. In terms of Angola, these are some of the more charismatic animals we're finding. Some of the reed frogs are amazing out there. The green ones especially, they just dominate these ephemeral wetlands and they just take over. The grass frogs, which is probably one of the hardest groups, the LBJs of the frog world, no one has a clue. So whenever I take this to my professor, I ask him, what do you think this is? I was like, I don't know. No one knows. Over this, you've got the toads, and then you've got the hemesis, which I absolutely love. They look like pig frogs. They use their big snout to burrow. As well, you've got the Cassina. That's probably the fattest Cassina on planet Earth. He's very porky. He's a porky princess. And this guy was eating and eating and eating. And they are probably another group that I would recommend looking at because they're so widespread. Platanas as well, Xenopus, these guys are well known as well, but they have basically been able to utilize and adapt to most aquatic ecosystems in Africa. And then my favorite, the tree frogs, very beautiful animals. And Angola has been producing more and more every time we go back. In terms of the region, there's been substantial discoveries. This is actually a bit outdated now. The more we look at it, the more we find. So last time I checked, about 22 new lizards, 5 new snake species, and 5 new amphibians. And this is just some of the working groups I'm with. There are other teams working in different parts of Angola, especially in the North Cabinda, that are finding more and more and more. Some of the work I've been involved with is Casanula. This one's very close to my heart. It's one of the first species we worked on, and we were showing an absolute flux in the taxonomy. This has actually been amended since, and Casanula is actually a sister genus to Affrixolith, but at the time, based on what we had available to us, we thought it was nested. So even with our advanced techniques, we're still seeing a shift in where we put these frogs relative to one another. Next is the red toad. This is quite a common species. If you go to Limpopo and Mpumalanga, you've probably come across this animal. It does very well in regions that other frogs don't. And because of that, they will consider to be one general widespread species. But after some work by Pedro Vaz Pinto and Linda Baptista and a whole cohort of other Portuguese scientists, they started to find that there was something that was a little bit different. As you can see just above it, it's super red and has a speckled belly. And since this, we have actually named it in honor of the late Bill Branch. He was probably the godfather of African herpetology with Donald Broadley. And he's had a lot of species named after him in the last few years because unfortunately he has passed away since. Next, this is one of my more recent papers that I did with the same working group, Javier Bon Rivera, Werner Conradi, Ninda, and Pedro. And as you can see in the frog world, we take it very seriously with systematics. It's very competitive. So we make sure we tick every box with every species concept we can, short of making them mate, which is unethical. So we are regularly doing CT scanning to look at skeletal and bone structure. We do multi-locus phylogenetics and species descriptions. We've got haplotype networks, and the morphology is still a key component. There's never going to be a world where we don't need morphology. And when we combine these techniques together, we're starting to find really nice, robust, and repeatable results when it comes to splitting taxonomy accurately and reliably. So this one here is called Poinafrinus. It's a pygmy toad. We described two of them from the Namba Mountains of Angola. And they are a group that we find in South Africa too, but they're amazing because they live in these puddles on rocks. They deposit their eggs there. They emerge very quickly. And this was actually covered very extensively by the news because just how many eggs and how many tadpoles were laid in the last, one of the reports. In terms of Angola, the first time I went was great because you go with a nice big team. The second time, which was last year, we went, let's just have a go. And obviously the sweat bees found me. I found my first Gaboon adder. Unfortunately, he's sleeping forever, so I never got to take photos of him. The car broke ridiculously all the time. It was a rough trip, but because of it, we actually got to go to places I never got to go the first time, which resulted in us finding a lot of new material. And it just shows you that even though everyone is so intensely looking in this country, there's still so much to find. So I'm expecting a lot of cool things to come out of this in the next few months. In terms of Angola, like I just said, there's just so much more to find. So about 130 species of snake known from Angola, and we're expecting to find more. I know of several that are currently in the process of being described. And in terms of Bill Branch, he predicted that we would find over 100 new species of reptile in Angola. And that's when he was still with us, and we're still finding more and more the more we look. I quickly want to just touch on this trip. I just recently joined a company or a non-profit company called Hankuzi Explorations, which is dedicated to researching and basically developing biodiversity data for the most remote places in Africa. My boss chose DRC, then he chose one of the most hostile parts of DRC, Pemba National Park. As you can see, you make friends with Daniel. Daniel's got the AK-47, so you make friends with him. And these oaks are very, very impressive. They're doing some amazing work. And it just goes to show that even though places they're not very interested in research, these guys on the ground are very passionate. This was quite an awesome little story. As we were getting into this park, he had compensated that otter from a local, and he actually, that otter was safely released that same day. So even though Congos are often seen to be as a place we cannot go and it's not welcoming, the rangers and the staff on the ground are very keen on research, especially when it comes to valuing these beautiful places. So in terms of where I was working on this last project, this was the Kabara Plateau. It's one of the plateaus of Pemba National Park in just about north of Lubumbashi, and it's dominated by three very distinct ecosystems. You've got the gallery forests, which have these rivers. You got the wetlands, which are pretty permanent, and then you've got these just massive strands of grassland. And what we tried to do was compare between these ecosystems using a regimented design. And we had snake traps set up in each of these ecosystems. At each of these sites, we paired them with acoustic song meters for bats and birds. We had Sherman trapping at each of the sites. We had insect traps, and we had reptile amphibian capturing. We took mycorrhizal fungi DNA sampling, and we took grass samples as well with the botanists at every site. So it was an incredible amount of work, but we're trying to effectively compare between the different ecosystems within the park, and over seasons, hopefully try to value the airspace in terms of which animals are occupying which niches at which time of year. Because unfortunately, this area goes up in flames every year because people are putting fires in to scare the mammals that are still around out. So if we can try and value these grasslands and show how important they are, hopefully it will come and it'll be used by Forgotten Parks Foundation, which they're very keen to use the data to try and implement nice conservation protocols to protect their small fauna, which is very, very abundant in the park. Based on our first few weeks there, we found a lot of rodents, and my absolute nemesis, shrews. They're evil, they come from Satan, and they love to eat snake traps. So they ate a lot of the stuff in my traps. They would often eat each other. That's Jeff's commonly holding that thing. I wouldn't touch. I hold a black mamba before I hold a shrew. And these animals were absolutely amazing. And even though the large mammals have been largely excluded from these ecosystems, we're seeing a massive amount of small rodents and also snakes. A huge amount of lizards as well, and the birds, the bats, and everything else was still there. So even though some of these places are considered to be no longer pristine because they lack mammals, they still have a lot to hold in terms of the other fauna. While we were there, we were also taking water samples, macro-invert samples, eDNA samples to try and value the wetlands compared to these amazing gallery forest rivers, which are permanent and contain lots of interesting fish. We were with an ichthyologist that is quite, everyone here knows, I think. Well, I know who knows. Albert knows him. He's a mate of him. When I met him, Emmanuel Agwe, and he thinks he's found a new fish while he was just with us in 2 weeks. So even though the place has been pretty well sampled by the Belgians, there's still a lot to be found. In terms of the frog photos, I haven't had time to kind of analyze them just yet. But what we're starting to see is a nice trend in which frogs are utilizing which spaces. These guys are very common in the grassland. Obviously, you've got Cacosternum lulupi, which is a really great find for the trip. Probably going to be the first one ever sequenced. And then we got this guy, which had me stumped for a while, which is most likely Hyperoleus cabara. So the cabara reed frog. That region we were working in had high levels of endemism. So a beautiful place with a lot of animals that only live there because of the high altitude. But in terms of this, we got a long way to go still with this research. We're hoping to get more trips out of it and hopefully include more of you in this research. We're looking for more systematics, more taxonomists, and more ecologists to join us and help us value these places. And in the next few years, we're hoping to go to different places as well. So thank you very much. These are some of my collaborators. I've worked with a lot of people, and I've been very, very fortunate over the years to work with some great labs, with some great scientists, and see some awesome animals. So if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Very interesting. Thank you, Chad. We can start with the questions, perhaps in the room. If you can just stand up and get closer to the mic so that people online can also just hear you. So I don't know who wants to kick it off.
I can speak very loudly.
Sure.
Why are there no newts in Africa?
No newts in Africa. You get the salamander, you get the fire salamander up in Morocco. That's the one, and he comes from there, but I don't know. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know. I would love to see them. I just recently went to America. I spent a week just looking for salamanders, which are probably the coolest animals on the planet. They're wet sausage dogs that look like lizards. I don't understand. Amazing animals. But I don't know why there's no newts in Africa. The Sicilians are quite abundant in the gallery forests and in the forest in the center and in Mozambique. But it looks perfect, but I don't think they got there.
Hamza, do you want to also just?
Somewhere in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned of one species that reproduces without water. How is that possible? And secondly, what is threatening frogs?
What is
threatening frogs? I'm not a frog person.
Oh.
Interested in know what
yeah. Threatening, yes. Frogs, unfortunately, a big threat to frogs. I'll go to both questions. So some frogs, not all frogs are 100% linked with water. So what these rain frogs do is they have their egg capsules in damp environments, generally in forests, and the entire tadpole stage will take place within the egg and they'll emerge as a froglet. So in most frogs, what happens is the egg is deposited in the water, emerges a tadpole, they metamorphosize. But these animals have basically removed the water from the scenario and they develop within that egg and emerge as a little frog. And I was doing a chapter the other day looking at reproduction, and we found up to 6 different reproductive styles for frogs. So, and especially with different types. So newt salamanders and Sicilians, they all have different strategies, but the frogs aren't as linked to water as everyone makes them out to be. They love the water, and their diversity is higher there. But you can find frogs that are very far removed. And in terms of threats, one of the biggest threats on the planet right now is unfortunately habitat loss and habitat degradation. A lot of these very small, very endemic species of frog are very sensitive to water changes. So if you start loading it with heavy metals and pollution, then they start to die out. We're starting to see in certain streams in certain places that frog diversity is definitely decreasing. While there are definitely frogs that can take advantage of these ecosystems, like toads and river frogs, there's a lot of the smaller, hyper-localized species that just can't deal with it. And of course, one of the biggest killers on the planet right now is chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus is all over the world. Africa hasn't got it as bad, but you go into Europe, you go into North America, and Southeast Asia, and chytrid fungus is taking out a lot of frogs very quickly. Yeah.
Thank you. Ryan, I think you had a question.
Thanks, Chad. That was a wonderful talk as usual.
Thank you, thank you.
I actually asked a really good question.
Doubled up with 2.
Just building on from that breviceps and that, that reproductive lifestyle where they don't need water. Is that okay? Let's forget about salamanders and newts and things, but frogs globally, is that quite unique? How common is that strategy? Firstly, and secondly,
Okay.
If you compare, if we look at the spectrum and you say, okay, toads breeding in wetlands, they produce strings of thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs.
Yes.
What does it mean for egg numbers? And are they producing? Presumably, they're putting a lot of investment into an egg if it needs to make it all the way through to toadlet.
Yes.
Sorry, froglet stage. Is there a trade-off with it? Do they produce very small clutches?
That's a very good question. So I'm not entirely sure about the numbers, but I would assume there's a lot less juveniles coming out of a clutch with the rain frogs, and with, like you say, with toads, they invest in very much, it's our selection, right? They just got lots, and they're investing in hopefully some survive, especially with most of these Hyperoleus, you'll find a Batrachus, you'll just see they'll dominate. There'll be so many eggs and so many tadpoles because a lot of it dries out. But these guys, they have to guarantee it. So there definitely is a lot more invested and less of them. So whenever we flip logs and we find them, you don't find a lot of little frogs, but most of them will make it. And then the strategy, I think it has come around in most of the world. You see it in different pockets, and depending on the group, how it got there, it differs. So it's not just one common evolutionary relationship. It's popped up independently throughout the phylogeny. And then you've got these phenomenal animals throughout Africa, like Nectophrinoides, which is I think it's one of the only live-bearing frogs. I can be corrected, Vanna will shout at me soon. But there is a few strategies. There's live-bearing completely, which is very, very rare. You get the egg laying, and then there's some specialized strategies in the salamanders. They use a different one too. But there's all these different strategies that these animals use to navigate the lack of water in some places. But yeah, hope I answered the question.
Thank you. I think we had another question in the room. No other question. So we'll move on to online questions. Okay, Tadiwa.
Thank you, Chad. That was a very interesting talk. My question is about the community engagement that you do as I mean, a lot of us here working on a lot of very tiny, small fish that no one eats, no one is very interested in. So when you got there into these communities, like aside from just telling them what they have in their environment, how do you get them to get the buy-in into actually wanting to conserve and protect these little animals that's generally...
So I slightly cheat because I can pair the frogs with a snake. And snakes are incredibly charismatic. So what I generally do, if I do frog stuff, I generally have some snakes with, and if you can sell one, you can sell all of them. Unfortunately, snakes are a massive one for us. If you can convince a kid to hold a snake for the first time, the glow in their face just galvanizes them for life. So we generally pair them with more charismatic stuff. Otherwise, one of the better ways to get around that is to take people into the environment. I've done that a few times. You take them out frogging in a wetland that's safe, and you take them to see the animals. You take them to see them calling, and while they're seeing it, while they're engrossed in nature, there's a lot more scope and ability to get them to love it. Just taking an animal out and letting them hold it in an isolated environment, you lose them. But as soon as you put them in the environment, you say, look at that frog, that's why it's important. Look at that one, that's why it's important. Do you guys like mosquitoes? And they go, no. You're like, or he eats the mosquitoes. And then it's like, oh, okay. But honestly, it is one of the hardest things, especially when you've got small fish that aren't living anymore in a jar. It takes a lot of talent. So it's creativity. You've got to be very creative with how you do it, but there's usually ways of getting around it. So if you can, putting them in the process, basically engrossing them in the science process can really help take their mind away from, it basically makes it more real for them. But yeah, I do agree, it will be very challenging for you. I was lucky with the animals I worked with. They're very colorful and pretty.
One more question from the room and then we'll move up to the online.
Excuse my ignorance, but what is Sicilian?
Sicilians. So they are amphibians. They look like snakes. A lot of people mistake them for snakes. Actually, a lot of them look like wet worms. They're just long, limbless, sometimes with small limbs or amphibians that evolved independently to live in underground burrows. So they're very aquatic driven. So, well, basically they love water. So they live in very damp, very wet environments. So often you only see them when the ground becomes so saturated they have to come up because their burrows are inundated with water. So no, there's none in South Africa. The closest ones are in Mozambique, northern Mozambique. So if it's really, really wet on the ground in these massive forests, you might see them coming up. Everyone thinks they're earthworms or wet snakes, but they're actually amphibians, yeah.
Great. So online, there's a lot of messages saying, thank you for the fantastic presentation. There's one question from Itumeleng saying, I might have missed this, but what are the methods that you use to detect and identify these various amphibian species?
Okay, yeah, so it varies. So often we will use lots of different methods. In the past, we used lots of wire traps for reptiles and for terrestrial frogs that move. And then what you also do is just active searching. So frogs in general, if it's a good night, it's warm and it's been raining, they're going to be calling actively. So the males call, they give away their positions, we follow the call. So a lot of us in the frog world are very good at echolocating and finding these animals, can be very challenging. So you can take them off their call. And in addition to that, you can also use song meters. So a lot of the scientists in the herpetological world use song meters, or same for birds, and you can pick up the call. Their calls are diagnostic, so you can basically identify them without ever seeing them. And then you can also now use eDNA because they live within the aquatic environment, which holds huge amounts of DNA load. If you can take filters with water, you can actually sequence them, compare them to online databases and pick them up. So the new research these days is kind of gearing towards a combination of active searching, acoustic searching, and eDNA to give a much broader understanding of ecosystems. Because if you go at the wrong time of year to the right place, you'll miss a frog. So it actually is making it much easier to get the full representation of an area if you basically combine different methods.
Thank you. One more question from Elsie online. How do different species of frog vary in their diets, and what do they typically eat?
So frogs are like the ultimate generalists. I think it's a large part of why they've been so successful. They are known to be generous with insects. A lot of them will just eat anything that flies. In terms of movement, the more it moves, the more likely it is to be eaten. The slower moving things get eaten less. But then as the frog gets bigger, their diet gets bigger. So like I said, the bullfrog is known to eat birds, bats, mice, other snakes. Toads have been known to eat mice. So when the animal gets big enough that it can consume something, it becomes a prey option. So just generally speaking, a frog is generous.
Another one from Abraham. What is the most effective method among all the ones you've used?
So the best method is the one when I get to see frogs. So the eating is not as fun. So we like to see frogs calling. I've got an absolute passion for finding reed frogs, mainly because they're cute, they're charismatic, and they're more forgiving than snakes. Unfortunately, with snakes, if you go into a field, you flip rocks, you might not find them. But frogs give themselves away. They're cool. The males are always looking for a mate. So finding them actively is way more fun than listening to an acoustic monitor and knowing you never got that photo.
Fantastic. Last call for questions online. You're also free and welcome to unmute and ask your questions live. Yeah, in the room, no other questions?
Oh, by the way, sorry guys. That photo over there is a Costa Rican frog. I just couldn't resist. Tiger frog. Yeah, you're not going to find him in your garden. He's from Costa Rica. But in the end, Africa has got way cooler frogs. It's the coolest place on the planet. Sorry, America.
Thank you, Chad. I think we've all learned a lot, so we appreciate it. And thanks to the audience online and in person here as well, that we've come to the end of the talk.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks,